Herbert Hoover is the man to set up a Belgian relief commission to feed Germany so we can have another 2 years of World War. And that's exactly what happened. The great engineer, he was called. He was actually the great...
He engineered 2 years longer for that war, anyway.
Well, he was the great swindler. He was the most notorious promoter of mining stocks in the world. And, you know, he particularly promoted gold mining stocks. And, you know, a gold mine is a mine in which someone sells you the stock in a gold mine, and they take the gold and give you the shaft. And so this was Herbert Hoover's background. He'd always given people the shaft. And so they said, now he's on the biggest swindle of all time. He's going to operate the Belgian Relief Commission. And he said, yes, I'll run the Belgian Relief Commission for you, and we'll feed Germany with one proviso. I'll get all the money. And he did. Herbert Hoover came out of World War I, and the Belgian Relief Commission is one of the richest men in the world.
No, it's my understanding that actually in World War I, 21,000 people in America also became millionaires amid the death and the destruction and the slaughter and the hardships of the soldiers. 21,000 people actually became millionaires. Does war itself, does it create different classes of individuals from a financial standpoint?
Well, war is enormously profitable because it's so destructive. You see, modern technology and modern industry produces so much that the competition drives the prices down, everybody goes bankrupt. So you have a war, and it destroys so much that then everybody gets rich again, replacing all the stuff that was destroyed in the war. That's the story of modern economy.
I read in your book also, Eustace, that the average working man, what they have said, and we're talking about members of the Federal Reserve, and we're talking about the elitist core, that the average working man should never rise above the certain level, that the rest of the income he takes in, the majority of that should be taken by taxes. Are we in a situation today where the average working man is just barely getting along, spending his whole life working, not being able to enjoy the opportunities and joys of life?
Well, actually, it's gotten a little worse than that. You've got all these homeless people sleeping under bridges. So it's actually, the plan of the international bankers is to have all of the producers, the workers, live on a bare subsistence level. And this is the basis of all taxation, of all government control of industry, is to make sure that the workers do not have a comfortable living, because they're afraid if they get too comfortable, they won't work as hard, you see. And this plan was devised by the diabolical mind of a man named David Ricardo in England in the early 19th century. He was an associate of the Rothschilds. He had become enormously wealthy through associating with the Rothschilds as a stock speculator in London. And so when these people make a lot of money, then they have leisure to sit down and figure out devilish plans to enslave everybody in the world. For some reason, when you get a lot of money, that's all you can think about, is making sure that everybody else in the world is going to work for you for the rest of their lives at a bare subsistence level. This is the plan David Ricardo worked out, and this is the basis of all governmental programs in the United States today. It's to keep the people at a bare subsistence level.
Now, we have this Federal Reserve system. Who owns the Federal Reserve, Eustace Mullins?
Well, any citizen of the United States will tell you, oh, the Federal Reserve System is owned by the government. And of course, they've been brainwashed to accept that. You go to any university in the United States, Yale, Harvard, take all the economics courses, they will never tell you that the Federal Reserve System is privately owned. Because the purpose of the universities is to misinform you, to keep you deluded.
By the way, do you mean to tell me that this program that we're doing today, Eustace Mullins, you'll find out more about the Federal Reserve than you will at Harvard or Yale in a full 4-year course?
Absolutely. In fact, you'll be finding it out for the first time because no one else is going to tell you this. And what they do is they hire, as professors of economics at the major universities, they pay them $100,000 a year to prevent them from ever telling their students any of the realities of economic life in America today.
Okay, so you have an ownership of a small group of people in this Federal Reserve. Are there a large group of people? Are there 100 people or 8 people or 20 people that have stock in this Federal Reserve system?
There are 100 families who own the stock of the 12th Federal Reserve banks. The government has never owned one share of any Federal Reserve bank. And the present banking chairman of the banking committee in Congress, Henry Gonzalez, he even says that it is a government bank, that it is not privately owned. And how he could say that when I published this book in 1952, it's been in print ever since, that the government has never owned a share of stock in the Federal Reserve banks. Well, the pretext to put this over on the people is that the President of the United States, who has been chosen and elected by the bankers, then chooses people who will serve as Federal Reserve Board of Governors. And they supposedly control the economic life of the United States. And of course, they're all stooges.
Now, if you take money, and if you're the one that can increase the money, or if you can have inflation or deflation, how does that itself, Eustace Mullins, how can that help or hinder a society, the increase of, and were these depressions that we had in this country, were they planned depressions?
Every depression was artificially engineered by purely mechanical means, by suddenly decreasing the money supply, by telling the banks to foreclose all their loans, and in other words, you bankrupt everybody in one fell swoop. Well, why do they want to bankrupt everybody? So they can take over their property at 1 cent on the dollar.
These gigantic foreclosures, I mean, we're talking about virtually tens of thousands of homes today in 1993 that are being foreclosed against. Is that part of this conspiracy against middle America by the international banking system or the Federal Reserve System?
That's absolutely correct. You see, the great enemy of the bankers and their conspiracy is an educated, well-informed middle class. They don't worry about the poor people because the poor people do not have enough capital or independence to ever mount any resistance, but the middle class can, because the middle class wants to defend its private homes, its little car sitting in the driveway, downsized, of course, the downsized home, the downsized car. These are all products of the bankers' conspiracy. I mean, there's no reason why you couldn't drive a car as long as this room, except the bankers want you to have a little car to keep you in your place. That's the whole idea.
You know, Eustace, one of the things I can recall 20 years ago or so, that gas used to be 25 or 35 cents a gallon, somewhere in there, whether it's premium or if you had unleaded or if you had regular. Now, we go from 25, 35, now it's $1.35, $1.40, whatever it may be. But there was this gigantic boom, and I was told back in 1972 that the Federal Reserve of St. Louis determined that they wanted 80% of the food and the fiber that was produced in this country. They wanted that in ownership of about 100,000 corporations. You see, we used to have 40 million farmers in this country, but they wanted to level those farmers down and put it in the form of corporations so they could control this food. And then the second thing was the fuel. But, you know, when I listen to things like that, I think it's so absolutely bizarre. Why would you take the strength of a culture, the farmer that can go out and raise a fine crop of children and give morality and give understanding and close to the soil, why would you take them away from the soil using the means of a Federal Reserve or the twisting of the money and inflation and deflation? Why would anybody want to do that, Eustace?
Well, the bankers do not want to see a strong, viable country or nation anywhere in the world. They want a weak, despairing people who are struggling for their daily bread, who could never mount opposition to them. They're the enemy of every nation in the world. And they work from within to destroy it. As you say, they weaken the country. I mean, why today in the schools is it so important to educate 6-year-old students on the importance of choosing an alternative lifestyle, of becoming homosexuals? Most 6-year-old students are not really concerned about what their future sex life is going to be. But they find that the program is so important, they've got to make them make up their minds by the time they're 7 years old that, well, I've decided I'm going to be a homosexual. And then there means no children, no stable home life, no nothing.
So you say that there's all these little conspiracies, it seems like, within a conspiracy, and it's meant to drive the morality of America to a very low ebb, the lowest we've been in for forever since our country began?
They're conducting war. I mean, you just saw the big shootout at Waco That's really typical of these people. They want to make war on you. And it's not government, it's the people behind the government. There is no government in the United States. And what you have are these conspirators behind the government. You have Bill Clinton being chosen out of nowhere to be president of the United States, member of the Trilateral Commission, coming out of a backward state like Arkansas, one of the poorest states in the United States, because the Rockefellers went in there and bought it in 1946. Winthrop Rockefeller III owns Arkansas, and he owns Bill Clinton. The Rockefellers own him lock, stock, and barrel.
Okay, now we found out, Eustace, so far that the Federal Reserve itself is not a government agency. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Not a government agency. But yet they say that the President of the United States appoints certain people to the Federal Reserve. If he can appoint people to the Federal Reserve, don't we, you and I, as tax-paying citizens, have some control over the Federal Reserve?
Well, have you ever suggested a candidate for the Federal Reserve Board to your congressman?
No, I haven't.
And if you did, how much attention would he pay to you? I mean, suppose you said, look, I'd like to see Eustace Mullins on the Federal Reserve Board. So you write your congressman, here's a man who spent 50 years studying the Federal Reserve System. Why don't you put him on there and let him work with these people? I can tell you what, your letter would go right in the trash, because these people are chosen out of New York and London and Paris. And their background has to be that they're part of the system, or they wouldn't even be considered.
Okay. We have a system. We have a system that works against the middle class.
Right.
And that system, how does it get its money? Where does it make its money from? Does it print money?
They have what they call the magical money machine, where you put in a blank piece of paper and crank out a $100 bill. And of course, con artists used to sell machines like that at county fairs to the suckers. So now, these bankers got together and sold that machine to the people of the United States.
And we're all the suckers for it, I guess, huh?
Well, they put in the blank pieces of paper and they hand out $100, but they don't give you the $100. You have to give them $100 worth of labor or real estate for it. In other words, nothing is free. In order to perpetuate their ownership of the magical money machine, the Federal Reserve System, they entered into the bill in 1913 when it went through Congress that you and I could never buy a share of stock in the magical money machine. In other words, the people who bought the original stock in 1914, they own it all today. It cannot be bought or sold on any stock exchange, because if you own a magical money machine, why would you let the suckers buy it from you? You sell them the paper, you don't sell them the machine itself.
Well, how did they purchase this magical money machine? I mean, did they pay somebody off, or was it, I mean, you mentioned before Jekyll Island, and I heard that there was a no-name club at Jekyll Island. Would you tell us a little bit about that, Eustace Mullins?
Well, these are very important bankers who met there secretly in November of 1910. They left Hoboken on a sealed train, and the reporters were there, because these were very important people, and the reporters said, where are you going? And they were all shouting and trying to get into the train to ask them questions. The train pulled out. They wouldn't say where they were going. They went to Brunswick, Georgia, which was the stopping place for Jekyll Island, which is just across the inlet there. And they went over to their private club, and they wrote the act in secrecy, and they stipulated it would be called a Federal Reserve System to delude the public. They stipulated that they would own the stock forever. You and I would never be allowed access to this stock. And they set up a money monopoly in violation of Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which provided, the Founding Fathers made sure to guarantee the people of the United States they would have their own money. Congress would have control over the money. So then, after they wrote this secret plan, they had to take it before Congress and persuade Congress to turn over this money power to the private bankers. They did it through bribery, through intimidation, and they got it through just before, they actually put it through after the Christmas vacation started, when some of the opponents left. Congressman Charles Augustus Lindbergh, the father of the aviator, had fought this bill through Congress. He said it establishes a perpetual money trust, and our children will be enslaved by this money trust. He said it all in 1913, and it all has come true. So they got the bill through on December the 23rd, 1913, after the opponents had left, and they immediately rushed it through. No other bill has ever been passed by Congress under the strange circumstances that the Federal Reserve Act was passed. And even the New York Times pointed out, they said, never has legislation of such major importance been passed in such circumstances.
What about the IRS? Did that come in near that same time?
Same year, 1913. The Income Tax Amendment was passed in 1913. The Rockefeller Foundation was chartered in 1913. The Federal Reserve Act was passed in 1913 so that we could have a world war a few months later in 1914. All of this, you see, 1913 is a symbolic year because we're dealing with people who have a deep root in the occult and in satanic work. So for them, 1913 was the year that they wanted to force everything over on the American people, and they did.
Now, the IRS, if you have the Internal Revenue Service, which is a collection agency for the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve, because those are 2 points, those are 2 of the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto. Would you say that as of 1913, from a legal standpoint for this country, that we were 20% communist at that time?
Oh, very much so. This is a communist system. In fact, the Federal Reserve bankers originated communism. That's not generally known. But, and you had